Passion. Passion is a loaded word. And we're not really talking about passion in the same sense that we think of passion when we use it today. Because passion is very often thought of as a really great thing. He has a passion for music. She has a passion for art. Someone has a passion to help the poor. Someone has a passion for fill in the blank of any number of good things that it's excellent to be passionate about. And I think when we say passionate, we mean that we put our energy, we put our money where our mouth is with regard to the things that we think are important. And when we think in those terms, we think of passion. But I don't know if you remember from last week when we talked about humility, the meanings of some of these words have kind of changed. We talked last week about humility as one of the virtues and how it wasn't self-humility or self-humiliation or false humility. It was a right understanding of who we are and with regard to where God is. And today I'm kind of turning the tables, and we're going to talk about what I'd like to call as sort of anti-virtues. And it's important because a handful of things on this list of what we call classic vices, which eventually became a list called the 7 deadly sins, which you won't find in the Bible. In fact, if you think of the 7 deadly sins, those things that we just read in Galatians that are those works of the flesh, that's not the list of the 7 deadly sins. It's a different list. But the 7 deadly sins has a long history that I'm going to get into because I think it's a good way to look at our ancient virtues and how we actually manifest those virtues in our lives. I think it's helpful to understand the other side of it. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time on vices than virtues perhaps today, but I think it's important to put it in perspective. But I want to explain a little bit about this word passion, or rather the passions. The passions, that's one of the things when we talk about the fruit of the Spirit. Right after that today, you might have remembered, and those who belong to Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and its desires. So if passion's such a good thing, like for instance, I would like to think that I preach relatively passionately, at least most of the time. And if that's a good thing, what are these passions that we're supposed to crucify? What are these passions that we're supposed to literally put to death within us as people who follow Jesus? And I think it's going to help to understand that unfortunately so much of Christian thought in the ancient world was shaped and influenced by the philosophies and the thinking of the secular world around them. Now, before you think to yourself, oh, I'm glad it's not like that today, it sure is today, isn't it? Very often we think of what is good and right and worthwhile in terms that maybe don't have anything to do with Scripture or the ways that Jesus asks us to follow Him. And that's not always necessarily a bad thing. There are some things that are good that aren't necessarily specifically addressed in Scripture. And there are some things that are good that are, and there are some things that are bad that are. But I want us to understand how the ancient world's first Christians were influenced by what was around them. And it's a little bit hard to grasp. So I'm not going to spend too much time here, but it's important. See, the ancient Christians lived in the world of, obviously, the first few centuries after Jesus came, which was a world that was highly influenced by Greek philosophy. And Greek philosophy worked its way into our thinking pretty early on. In some cases, the writers of the New Testament tried to redeem that. The best example, my favorite example of this is the very beginning of the Gospel of John, where he says, in the beginning was the Word, the Logos, this idea. John was basically trying to say this idea, this word, this Logos that you've heard about in philosophy is actually something that's way more important and more urgent than that. It's God's own ideas, God's own word, God's own Logos that actually became Jesus. And I think, unfortunately, some of the philosophies that worked its way into Christianity shaped it in a way that sometimes hurt us. But in this particular case, I want us to understand the context. So I want to really quickly, there's this idea from the ancient Greek philosophers. There's a metaphor of how we live our lives, how we make our choices, how we engage with the world, how we engage with what it is that we want and what it is that we should be doing, morality, etc. And imagine, if you will, a chariot with two horses. And I want to make sure I get these terms exactly the way that I wrote them down. So pardon me for using my notes a little bit more today. One of these horses is appetite or desire. And one of these horses is what we call spirited. It's more of anger. So think of desire and anger as these two horses. And the driver in the chariot is reason. This is an ancient Greek idea, okay? This is not necessarily, I'm not talking about Scripture right now, but I want you to understand the place that these people came from when they were trying to explain the vices, and as a result of that, on the other side, the virtues. Now here's the problem. The problem is that there's an assumption that if we are reasonable enough, we can tame our anger and our appetites and desires and control them to take us to the right place, on the right path. And there's a lot of people that figured, this is just not working out right. And these folks started something called the monastic movement. In the ancient world, there's a lot of reason that these people basically ran away from the cities and towns and out in the desert, and they went up the Nile, and eventually they were on their own in a cave or whatever, and eventually they came together in communities. And when they started coming into communities, they started to notice that all of the bad stuff in society that they were running away from came with them. What a surprise. And they started to kind of look at this and reason it out, and they had some of the scriptures sometimes. Remember, this is way before anybody had a New Testament on their shelf or a Bible on their shelf. They had scrolls, they had heard them, sometimes they had memorized them. And they're sitting around, and this one guy came up with this list. He came up with this list of vices. Now, it's funny because I'm going to talk about the 7 deadly sins, but there's 8 of them. Because this is a list that was eventually changed and distilled, and it became the list of the 7 deadly sins of later Middle Ages. But when I look at this list of these 8 passions, I think it basically shows us exactly what Galatians is telling us to crucify, to put to death within ourselves. And a lot of them don't make sense, again, because words' meanings have changed, haven't they? So this monk, he sat down, he wrote this list out, and I love the fact that it survived. Because some of this does apply to us, some of it doesn't apply to us the way it applied to him. Remember, these were monks that had left society. They were trying to escape from society and find God somehow. Many times they were sent back because God basically said, guess what? I need someone out there with the gospel, and here you are out in the desert. Let's go back there. But here's this list, and I want to explain it to you so that we can understand what it means, because they don't all mean what we think they mean today. The first one's gluttony. Gluttony is an easy one. Gluttony is basically you eat more than you need to, right? Or now in some cases it would have been thought of as creating more food than you need and wasting it as well. And I think that gluttony can travel across the lines of food to basically anything. Anything where we overconsume in this world, or have, and we'll find that this idea of me having more than everybody else lies at the heart of so many of these, but gluttony especially. The idea of gluttony that I really need to eat all that food? I really need to have all that stuff? And the idea was to kind of put that to death is sort of a kind of a temperance. It's like, well, let's just have what we need. Let's not have so much more than we need. That bleeds into some of the rest of this. Now, the next one is avarice. Avarice or selfishness. The idea here is not just that I have more than I need, and these early monks were not going to, they were not going to condemn you and I preparing for the future. In other words, they wouldn't say it's selfish to plan for retirement. They would never say that. That's not what this is getting at. This is not, the opposite of selfishness is not that I give away everything. Although Jesus did occasionally tell somebody to give away everything. But the opposite of this is basically the unwillingness to share when we can. So if I put away what I need for tomorrow, for a rainy day, for retirement, that's a good thing. When I put away 10 times as much as I could ever possibly need, maybe not. I think of this every now and then when I look at some of the famous rich people of our time who get to a point where they have so much that they realize their mission in life needs to now be to give it all away. I'm thinking of people, Bill Gates is a great example of that. And I would definitely not put him in the saint category. Not necessarily anybody that follows Jesus as far as I know. He thinks what you and I are doing this morning is a complete waste of time. He's on record as saying that. By the way, he's right. It is a waste of time. It's just a really good waste of time. But the idea is that sometimes folks will get to the point where they realize, oh, I'm squirreling so much away, I really need to find a way to be generous with this. And for you and I, that's where we need to find the balance, and that's where we need to get a hold of crucifying avarice within ourselves and looking at our lives from a perspective of how can I be generous? How can I give? How can I reasonably give? How can I even budget giving? Next one is one that meant something very different to these monks than us. It's impurity. And this is particularly sexual impurity. Now, remember, these monks in many cases had taken a vow of celibacy. And in many cases, that wasn't necessarily just because they wanted to avoid pleasure. It was because they wanted to avoid the bonds of a family that would then tie them down. It was a relational thing where they would be freer to follow God if they did not have a family than if they did. I mean, Paul even hints at this in one of his letters. It's better if someone's unmarried, they should stay that way if they can, he's basically saying, because then you're freer to follow God. It means something very different to us today. But it's interesting that we still really struggle in our society with this as much as anything. Now, I would say to you that I would think that this idea of impurity, especially when you think of the way that sexual mores are in our society, is very similar to gluttony. It's like, well, it's all about what I get. Give me more, which is related to some of these others that we're going to talk about here. So, the next one is the one that's really strange. In fact, this one probably isn't on the list of the quote-unquote 7 deadly sins for a good reason. And but this was on those original monks' lists. It's depression or sadness. I'm so glad that we live in a society and live in a time when we have advanced our own understanding of the way the body works to know that sometimes the organ that is inside your head can actually be ill just like your heart can be or your lungs can be. Because so much of what we think of as sadness or depression, where we used to say snap out of it, we do recognize now is actually a verifiable illness. I heard a joke recently, somebody saying, well, when you're sad or you're depressed, it's just in your head. You should just get over it. To which someone answered, really? Well, the next time you have a cold, that's just in your lungs. You should get over it. Not that simple, is it? So, I think we can think of this in terms of the ways that we can put ourselves in places to just feed into depression and sadness. There are times when you need to be alone, and there's times when you really don't need to be. You really need not to be alone. There's times, I would say that the way that we put this to death within our own members is when we say, you know what, if I'm struggling, it would be great to get help. I have so many friends whose lives are different now than they were before simply because they've been medicated for whatever is going on in their head. And totally and completely regular members of society. So, again, thank you, Jesus, that we live in the time that we live in, when we know how to deal with and treat these things and we don't have to stigmatize them as much. So the next one is actually maybe the worst and most destructive of all of the passions that we need to put to death within us, and that is anger. I'm good at angry. I'm very, very good at angry. I'm best at angry when I'm driving. Not at the other guy on the road, although sometimes, but at myself when when I miss the turn because the GPS confused me. I get confused on the road and then I get mad. Or if I'm late somewhere, or if something's not going right for me, I can get really good at anger. And sometimes we whip that anger into a frenzy. The best example of this is the thing that happens in families all the time. Someone does something wrong in your family, and what do we do back to them? The silent treatment. Silent treatment is just the best, just weird way of anger that it seems, it doesn't make sense, but we do it. And then eventually maybe we get over it. But anger anger ends up getting destructive. Now in our society, sometimes we actually celebrate. You got to get angry at things that are wrong in the world. And maybe that's true, but not to the point where it becomes destructive. I think sometimes of times when I've read stories about protests that started out as people legitimately complaining about something that needed to be addressed and ended up with somebody getting angry and hitting somebody or throwing something. It's just, gosh, that's just not the way to go. Or worse, gathering together only because of anger. Only because of anger. That can be a lot destructive. Next one is something called acedia. This is restless boredom. This was actually listed as one of these terrible vices to be avoided and to put to death. This restless boredom. This is one we don't think of a lot, but this is the one that leads to the person who has an affair just because they're bored. This is the person that can't hold on to a job just because they get bored. I've known a handful of folks that worked for 20 years for 16 different companies. And it's like, how much better off you would have been if you just would have stayed with one for a while. But we get this restless boredom. Now, this is not like where you're not being challenged. This is just where we decide we don't like things the way they are and wish they were different and just sort of sit around and stew about it. Restless boredom, that's kind of a weird one. But the last two seem to be the ones that are most opposed to the solution to this that we have in Galatians. The first one is something called vainglory. I love this word, vainglory, and I don't remember the original Greek term, but it was changed and somebody came up with a Latin word for it. Vainglory is this idea that you respecting me is more important than God loving me. That whatever I do to try to get the approval of other men, of other human beings, of other people, and only for that. It's my way of making myself look better than or more important than everybody else. It's kind of a strange one because you're thinking of another word, but the other word you're thinking of for that is the final one of these, and you might argue that it's the source of all of them, and that one's pride. Pride is where we value ourselves falsely. It's the absolute opposite of humility. And when you think about it, isn't pride where I think of myself? I'm not trying to get you to think of myself better, but I think of myself as better than everybody else, including God. Isn't that the opposite of putting myself in the proper place in the universe, like we talked about with humility? Where I recognize my value, but I also recognize my shortcomings? No, pride doesn't recognize either of them. Interestingly enough, very often today we think of pride as the sin that led to that original sin of Adam and Eve, deciding they wanted to be like God. Being like themselves was enough. They were going to eat that tree. The fruit from that tree they weren't allowed to touch. They were going to eat that one. People think of that as pride. These early monks thought of that sin as gluttony. Wanting something I don't deserve, wanting something I shouldn't have. So they're all kind of linked. And what happens with all of these things is that they end up being the things that combat the work that God is trying to do in the world. These attitudes and the actions that come out of them are basically the things that kill the work of God in us and in the world. Aren't they? Really, they are. I mean, I want you to think, for instance, of a time when you've been really, really angry at a family member and you just let them have it. I'm guessing that wasn't a time when you felt close to God. So there might be a reason for that. Might be the Spirit within us saying this is not what God is about in the world. And in a sense, you could say that the whole of the Jewish law was to combat things like this. The law of the Old Testament, the thou shalt nots, all of these rules and regulations on all the things that you do, the rules for worship to make sure that we understand how much higher than us God is, were to combat these attitudes of the heart, these vices that can take over and turn our lives and our communities into just terrible things. Because in a sense, all of these then are against God's law. Does that make sense? Do you understand what I mean by that? These are kind of against God's law. We know what God's law is about. It's loving God the most. It's loving our neighbors ourselves. That's what it is. The entire list of laws in the Old Testament hang on those two things. That's what Jesus told us. Someone asked him, what's the greatest commandment? It was a trick question because the answer is supposed to be they're all equally important. But Jesus said, you know what? There is a greatest commandment. There's two of them. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. You do those two things, all the rest of the law is hanging on to that. So what is it? What is the key? What is the way that you and I can get away from the passions? These things that drive us to do, say, and be what we don't want to do, say, and be. And the answer is the things that aren't against the law. There's a little note in here that gives us a hint to that. By contrast, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. There is no law against such things. Nowhere in the Old Testament law, nowhere in any decent law of any God-fearing person that has ever lived will you find these things on a list of things you don't do, right? Any rule of a monk, any rule of the order of a group of monks or anything like that, any kind of catechism or rule of life that anybody's ever come up with within the bonds of those who follow God, you'll never find a law against these things. They're all, and I love it because Paul is actually writing this letter to people that have gotten all confused about legalism. They're trying to follow the law really carefully. So carefully that they're forcing people to do things that they shouldn't need to do in order to be saved. And here he is saying, okay, you guys want to be legalists? Let's be legalists. Here's the things there's no law against. That's what we do. But then he starts it with something. He says, by contrast, the fruit of the Spirit. And this is where the really good news comes in. Because this isn't something that we put on and we fake. This isn't something that we do in a very real sense. This is something that comes out of us because of the Spirit in us. Which, by the way, means we can't take any glory in it anyway. Anything good that I do is basically because of the Spirit of God living in me and working through me because of what Jesus has done. It's not because I'm a loving person. It's because God has planted God's love in me. God has planted God's Spirit in me.